Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese. Today's video is going to be all about the history of writing in Portuguese. I have previously done a video about the Orthographic Agreement of 1990 and even some of the things that did not change about Portuguese writing in it. So if you're interested, I'd highly recommend you check out those videos. Before we get started with today's video, however, if you are enjoying my videos and my channel and you'd like to support me, you can do so on Patreon. Patreon is a place where you can basically buy me a coffee each month, and in return you get access to extra things. Those extra things include knowing about what I'm working on next first, access to research and other materials that I'm using for my videos, as well as fun things like postcards directly from me to you. Patrons also have priority when suggesting video topics, as well as getting their questions answered. So if that sounds interesting to you, head on over to patreon.com/Sashinka where you can find out all of the details. Now, on with the video. When we're talking about the history of writing in Portuguese, what we're really talking about is the history of systems of writing in Portuguese. Nowadays, Portuguese has a standard orthography or system of writing. Most major languages, especially European languages, have regulatory bodies that officially, legally determine how those languages are supposed to be written in an official capacity. Portuguese is, of course, nowadays one of those languages, but it was not always the case. When you think of languages that have official regulatory bodies that determine how they're supposed to be spelled and give suggestions and recommendations based on that, you might think of languages like Spanish or French or Italian, which go back as far as the 16th century in regulating the way that they have been written. Those languages had regulatory bodies such as academies set up for them early on. But languages like English never set up regulatory bodies like that. Instead, languages like English just rely on spelling conventions, or the general sum of what we consider to be acceptable good writing. Portuguese throughout its history did not have an official regulatory body that guided how the language was supposed to be written. So for most of Portuguese history, there were many spelling conventions in place, and authors would write according to what they saw fit. Standardized, uniform Portuguese spelling did not come about until the early 20th century. This was a process that was fraught with many political and popular obstacles, but we'll get into the timeline of the orthographic agreements of Portuguese in just a little bit. Now, however, when we're talking about the history of writing in Portuguese, we have to go all the way back to the beginning of Portuguese as a language. In the beginning period of Galaico-Portuguese or Galician Portuguese, when Portugal had not become its own independent political entity and therefore had not yet set up administrative legal structures that governed the usage of the language in an official capacity, the language itself was still being used and still being written. And this period also marked the transition from vulgar Latin to the local languages in both writing and popular common and even administrative uses. In the medieval period, as Galician Portuguese was consolidating itself as a language in its own right as opposed to just being corrupted Latin, many different spelling conventions emerged as there was no one singular way of writing the language at that time. Many of the stylistic forms of modern written Portuguese actually do date back to this period as well. The medieval period of Galician Portuguese and later Portuguese as its own distinct linguistic entity in an official capacity is that the writing systems being used in this period are largely phonemic. What this means is that for each sound or phoneme that is spoken in the language, there was one written form that was associated with it. Although different writers in this period had different ways of going about that, they basically wrote along that guiding principle. This, of course, is in contrast to modern languages that have highly non-phonemic spelling, like English or French, which have their own historical reasons for writing in that manner. In linguistics, one of the ways that we can track how languages change over time is to observe the differences in the patterns of writing them. So throughout the medieval period, as Galician Portuguese and later just Portuguese itself was consolidating itself as a language and developing a written tradition, we see different patterns of writing over time and even things like mistakes that writers would habitually make that inform us as to how people were pronouncing versus the way that they were expected to be writing the language. This is especially true of the early medieval period when the language was undergoing great shifts in its sounds and patterns when compared with Latin. Some of the most defining spelling conventions of modern languages come from that time period. You may have been wondering why in Portuguese we have an LH and an NH, where Spanish uses an LL and an N with a tilde on it. Italian uses a GL and a GN, Catalan uses an LL and an NY, and there are countless variations to how we write these sounds. The LH and the NH comes in fact from Old Occitan. Occitan, or Provençal, is the name of the language that was spoken in what is now the south of France. It had its heyday in the middle of the medieval period. Occitan was the language of the troubadours and a language of poetry and culture, and this lasted for several hundred years up until about the 14th century. Popular history attributes the adoption in Portuguese of these Occitan forms to King Denis, or Dom Dinis, who was the king of Portugal who would set Portuguese as the state language officially. He himself was a prolific writer of poetry and was a great admirer of the Occitan troubadours, and so it is said that he preferred these Occitan forms to represent these sounds, and therefore they became widespread as other people in the period followed his lead in their writing. This would have happened in the mid to late 1200s, and it is undeniable that these forms probably gained their widest traction and universality in Portuguese because of this official preference for them by the king who set Portuguese as the language of the country. But these forms have been observed since well before then, and may have been introduced to the region by monks or other clergy from the south of France who would have introduced their familiar Occitan way of writing to the language that was spoken in the northwestern corner of the Iberian Peninsula. One way or another, these forms, LH and NH, to make L and N sounds, came to be the way that they are written in Portuguese from then on. And it is also true that they continue to be the way that they are written in Occitan to this very day as well. Other ways of writing were more popular in the Galician region and even in Castile, and those would lead to different orthographic conventions that were used throughout history. So from the earliest period of Galician Portuguese through to the Renaissance, where Portuguese had already been the state official language of Portugal as a kingdom for hundreds of years, writers used a predominantly phonemic system of writing. But the Renaissance brought about big changes to how Portuguese would come to be written, in part because of the Iberian Union, in which the crowns of Portugal and Spain were merged. Many Portuguese writers sought to distance themselves from Spanish. This is one of the reasons why etymological spellings began to appear in Portuguese. One of the other justifications for etymological spellings was to justify the usage of words as being genuinely Portuguese and having a genuine source in Latin or Greek. So certain spelling conventions came to be adopted, including a myriad of silent letters. If you've ever seen words like teatro or Tiago, spelled with a TH, or farmácia, spelled with a PH, then you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about etymological spelling. These spellings don't rely on the phonemes or the sounds of the language, but in fact they rely on how they were spelled in Latin and Greek. In the case of Greek, they used the common transliterations into the Latin alphabet of Greek spellings. It was quite common to see a lot of unnecessary letters, letters that didn't make any sound, and even letters that were duplicative, like the Y in Portuguese. Naturally speaking, this would lead to many words that had false etymologies applied to them in order to justify a new etymological spelling of them. And this type of spelling persisted until the early 1900s, when the first orthographic agreements started to pop up. It wasn't until 1911 when we got the first orthographic agreement in Portugal. This was the first time that Portuguese spelling had come to be regulated in an official capacity. The reforms of Portuguese spelling in the first half of the 20th century were largely a back and forth between the Portuguese and Brazilian governments and these regulatory bodies of the Portuguese language. So in 1911, Portugal embarked on reforming spelling, and that would last for a few decades. In 1931, using the reforms of 1911 as a basis in order to remove a lot of the silent letters, the two academies formed an agreement to reform Portuguese spelling yet again. The 1931 agreement would set the stage for the negotiations for standardizing Portuguese orthography yet further in the 1940s. From 1943 to 1945, changes to the orthography of Portuguese were implemented in Brazil and Portugal. The 1945 Orthographic Agreement was technically signed by Portugal and Brazil, but Brazil had undertaken an orthographic reform in 1943. So although the Brazilian government signed the 1945 agreement into law, the 1945 agreement never actually went into effect in Brazil because it was not ratified by the Brazilian legislature. Portugal continued on with the 1945 agreement, using that until implementing the 1990 agreement. Brazil, for its part, continued along with the 1943 agreement. And although these standards were fairly similar, they had plenty of differences. This period of the first half of the 20th century is where the major differences between Brazilian and European Portuguese spelling come from. Before then, because spelling was so variable in the Portuguese-speaking world, there were just as many differences as there were similarities to the writing in both places. The reforms of the 1940s gave way in the 1970s to the elimination of a lot of diacritics. In 1971, Brazil got rid of most of the diacritics still in use in its writing, and in 1973, Portugal followed suit. The countries and regulatory bodies would come together in 1986 to attempt a radical transformation of Portuguese writing, eliminating almost all diacritics in Portuguese in a way similar to how Italian nowadays is written, but that spelling reform was widely rejected by the Portuguese-speaking public and was later shelved. The third major spelling reform or orthographic agreement of 1990 is the current standard of writing in Portuguese. This agreement came about as the result of a middle ground between the radical changes proposed in 1986 and the gradual pace of eliminating etymological spellings in favor of phonemic spellings for the language up until then. This is why even with the orthographic agreement of 1990, there are still some etymological quirks and even differences between Portugal and Brazil in terms of writing. However, nowadays the driving principle behind written Portuguese is that Portuguese should be written in an essentially phonemic way. Although there are some phonemes in modern Portuguese that have significant variation in writing, Portuguese has returned to a more phonemic spelling. The difference between nowadays and the medieval period, when Portuguese was written in a largely phonemic way, is that nowadays we have a single unified standard of writing. In the medieval period, there were many different systems of writing in a phonemic way. Different writers would rely on different conventions in order to write down words as they sounded. This long, untamed history of Portuguese writing is also the reason why Portuguese writing is not as consistent between Portugal and Brazil as a language like Spanish between Spain and Latin American countries is itself. Now, there is quite a lot to get into further detail about Portuguese writing and its history, especially in this modern period of the orthographic agreements. If you're interested in me doing a video about these orthographic agreements before 1990, leave me a comment down below. But for now, I think we've gotten a pretty good overview of the history of writing in Portuguese. That's all I've got for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, leave me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I make lots of videos about the Portuguese language, which you can find in playlists directly on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.